"Sit down, girl," they sneered. A quiet cowboy stepped in and turned it into a rescue. The small town lay quiet under the early morning sun, the kind of place where everyone knew each other and life moved slowly. Wooden fences lined the streets, and dusty roads wound between low buildings that housed everything from a small grocery to a local cafe. Birds chirped lazily, and the faint sound of a wind chime from a nearby porch added a soft rhythm to the morning. It was the kind of town where people greeted each other by name, and news traveled fast, but sometimes, even in small towns, trouble found its way in. At the center of town, near the corner where the cafe opened its doors to the street, a young woman walked quickly, carrying a small bag of groceries. Her steps were light but purposeful, and her eyes scanned the street as she passed the familiar shops. She liked mornings like this, peaceful and quiet, where she could enjoy the little things without rushing. But on this morning, she didn't notice the group of men leaning against the side of the cafe, their voices low but full of mischief. The men were tall, rough-looking, and carried an air of arrogance that made their presence impossible to ignore. They had been lingering there for some time, joking loudly and casting glances at anyone who passed. When they saw the young woman, something in their tone shifted. Their voices grew louder and the teasing words started. "Sit down, girl," one of them sneered, a smirk curling at the edge of his lips. It was said with a kind of mock authority, as if he thought he had the right to command anyone in town. Another laughed, adding his own comments, and the group's energy became heavier, more threatening. The young woman stopped for a moment, her hands gripping the handles of her bag a little tighter. She had faced rude comments before, but the confidence in their voices and the sneers on their faces made her uneasy. She knew she could ignore them, but something about the way they carried themselves made her pause. She tried to keep walking, hoping they would leave her alone, but they stepped in front of her path, blocking the sidewalk with wide grins that did not reach their eyes. "Come on, girl," one said again, louder this time. "Sit down. You don't belong here walking around like you own the place." The young woman swallowed hard. She wanted to speak, to tell them they had no right, but her voice caught in her throat. She was not weak, but the sudden confrontation left her momentarily frozen. Her heart beat faster, and she could feel the stares of other people around. Some watched from a distance, unsure if they should step in, while others pretended not to notice. Then he appeared. The cowboy had been leaning against the fence of the nearby stable, cleaning the dust off his boots. He was quiet, the kind of man who didn't speak much but always noticed everything. His hat shaded his face, and a soft breeze stirred the edges of his coat. He had seen the situation unfold from across the street, and though he didn't rush forward, his eyes followed the young woman closely. There was something in the way she held herself that reminded him of his sister, someone he had always wanted to protect. He stepped onto the sidewalk, his movements deliberate, calm, and confident. The men noticed him and laughed at first, thinking he was just another passerby who might be intimidated by them. But there was a difference in his presence. He didn't yell, he didn't push or shove. He simply walked toward them, and the energy in the air began to shift. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice low but firm. It carried a weight that made the men pause for a moment. The young woman glanced at him, relief mixing with curiosity. She didn't know him, but there was something about his calm manner that made her believe he might actually help. The tallest of the men, trying to regain control, stepped closer. "Who's asking? This is our spot," he said, though his voice wavered slightly. The cowboy tilted his hat back and looked at him directly. "It's my problem if someone is being treated unfairly," he said simply. There was no anger in his voice, no desire to escalate, just quiet authority. The group laughed nervously, unsure how to respond. They had expected fear, maybe resistance, but not this. No one had ever stood up to them like this, and the sudden silence made them uncomfortable. The young woman took a small step back, her hands still holding her bag. She felt a mixture of fear and hope. Fear because the men were still there, looming over her, but hope because someone had chosen to intervene. She realized she wasn't alone in facing this. The cowboy continued to advance slowly, stopping just a few feet away from the group. He didn't raise his voice, but the calm determination in his stance spoke volumes. "Step aside," he said simply. "Let her pass." For a moment the men hesitated. The youngest one muttered something under his breath, trying to regain courage, but the cowboy's gaze didn't waver. His presence alone was enough to make them reconsider. The energy that had been heavy and mocking began to falter. The young woman, feeling the shift, straightened her back. She walked forward cautiously, her eyes on the men but also glancing at the cowboy. She had never expected anyone to intervene, and she wasn't sure how to respond. Gratitude swelled inside her, though she kept her voice calm. "Thank you," she whispered, almost afraid to speak too loudly. The cowboy nodded slightly, acknowledging her words without making a scene. His focus remained on the group, ensuring they wouldn't make any sudden moves. The men exchanged uneasy glances. They had underestimated the quiet cowboy, expecting fear instead of calm authority. One of them finally stepped back, muttering something about leaving, while the others followed reluctantly. Their confidence had been shaken, and they realized that their usual intimidation tactics didn't work on everyone. The young woman continued walking, her steps more steady now. She felt a mix of relief and admiration for the man who had stepped in. She didn't know his name, but she understood something important. Courage didn't always roar. Sometimes it was quiet and steady, enough to change the course of events without raising a hand. As they reached the edge of the cafe, the cowboy finally relaxed slightly, though he stayed nearby just in case. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft but genuine. She nodded. "Yes, thanks to you," she said, her smile small but sincere. She had regained a sense of control over the situation, and it was a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. The cowboy tipped his hat, a small gesture of reassurance. He didn't need thanks or recognition. It was enough that she was safe. He had seen too many people intimidated by others in his lifetime, and he had learned that standing quietly, with courage and care, could be more powerful than confrontation. As the young woman walked away, the cowboy watched her go, thinking about the small victories that often went unnoticed. In a town like this, moments of courage didn't always make the headlines, but they mattered. They shaped lives, restored confidence, and reminded people that kindness and bravery could coexist. The morning returned to its calm rhythm, the birds continued to sing, and the wind chimes tinkled softly. But for the young woman and the cowboy, the day had changed. Something had shifted in the air, a reminder that even in quiet towns, courage could appear when it was needed most. And sometimes, it came in the form of a quiet cowboy who didn't seek attention but acted when it truly mattered. For the young woman, it was a lesson she would carry with her. That strength didn't always mean fighting with fists or raising one's voice. Sometimes, it meant believing that someone would stand with you when you needed it most. And for the cowboy, it was another reminder that a simple act of intervention could turn fear into safety and uncertainty into hope. As the town went about its morning routines, people noticed subtle changes. Some spoke in hushed tones about what had happened, others glanced at the cowboy with newfound respect. And though he didn't seek it, he had left a mark on the community, one that would linger quietly but meaningfully, inspiring others in ways no one could yet see. The young woman reached her home, carrying not just her groceries, but a renewed sense of confidence. She thought about how fear had felt so close just moments before, and how quickly it had dissipated when someone had chosen to act. She smiled to herself, realizing that courage didn't always have to be loud. It could be steady, reliable, and quietly heroic. And somewhere down the street, the cowboy mounted his horse, tipped his hat to the morning sun, and rode on. He didn't know if anyone would remember him, and he didn't care. What mattered was that he had stepped in, that someone had been safe, and that the quiet strength he carried had made a difference in the world, even if only for a single morning. The town had settled back into its morning rhythm, but the young woman couldn't shake the memory of the men's sneers. Their words echoed in her mind, a reminder of how quickly intimidation could strike, even in a place where she had always felt safe. She moved slowly through the streets, her steps measured, her eyes scanning the familiar shops and fences. It was as if the town itself had grown sharper, more alert, and her senses were heightened in ways she hadn't expected. The cowboy's presence lingered in her thoughts. His calm demeanor, the way he had stood between her and the men, had left a mark on her. She didn't know his name or why he had chosen to intervene, but she understood something vital. Courage didn't always need to be loud or showy. Sometimes it came quietly, steady, and certain, and that was far more powerful than any shout or gesture of anger. Meanwhile, across town, the men gathered again, this time in a quiet corner of the general store. Their laughter was subdued, edged with irritation and disbelief. "Did you see that?" one said, shaking his head. "He just walked right up to us and told us to back off like it was nothing." "I don't know who he thinks he is," another muttered. Nobody just tells us what to do. We're the ones in charge here." Their arrogance hadn't disappeared, but doubt had begun to creep in. The man who had first sneered at the young woman ran a hand through his hair, clearly unsettled. "Maybe we overdid it," he said, his tone hesitant. "Nobody has ever stood up to us like that before." Their confidence had been shaken, but their desire to assert control remained. They weren't going to forget the morning's events, and some part of them wanted a chance to prove themselves, to reclaim the power they had lost. The young woman, meanwhile, reached her home and set down her groceries. She could feel her heart still racing from the encounter, a mixture of fear, relief, and awe swirling within her. Her hands shook slightly as she unpacked her bag, but each item she placed on the counter grounded her a little more. She realized she had been carrying not just groceries, but the weight of anxiety that had been building for weeks. And now, because of the cowboy's intervention, a small sense of hope had taken its place. She couldn't stop thinking about him. Who was he? Why had he done this? He didn't know her, hadn't asked for anything in return, and yet he had stepped in when she needed help the most. It made her wonder about the other people in town. How many times had they needed help but had no one to turn to? How many moments had passed without intervention because no one had the courage to act? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She froze for a moment, unsure if she should answer. When she did, it wasn't the men who had harassed her. It was a neighbor, a kindly woman who lived a few houses down. "I saw what happened this morning," the neighbor said softly, stepping inside. "Are you all right?" The young woman nodded, grateful for the concern. "Yes, thanks to him, there was a cowboy. He stepped in." The neighbor's eyes widened. "A cowboy here in town? That's unusual. Most people keep to themselves." "Yes," the young woman said. "He didn't yell, didn't fight. He just stood there and it was enough. They backed off." The neighbor smiled gently. "Sometimes that's all it takes. People forget that quiet strength can be more powerful than anger or intimidation." As they talked, the young woman realized she wanted to understand more. She wanted to know who this cowboy was, why he had acted when so many others hadn't, and how he had learned to carry such calm authority. She had questions that couldn't be answered by gratitude alone. Later that day, the cowboy could be seen in town again, riding slowly along the main street. He didn't make a show of it, didn't stop to draw attention, but people noticed. There was something about the way he moved, a steady confidence that seemed to ripple through the town. Some people nodded respectfully as he passed. Others whispered quietly to one another, unsure of what to make of him, but sensing that he was different from anyone they had seen before. The young woman watched from a distance, her curiosity growing. She didn't approach immediately, but she couldn't ignore the pull of wanting to understand the person who had changed her morning so dramatically. She lingered near the street corner, pretending to look at the shop windows, while her mind raced with thoughts about courage, kindness, and the quiet ways people could make a difference. Meanwhile, the men were not done. Their pride had been wounded, and some part of them couldn't accept that they had been intimidated by someone they considered quiet, unassuming, and perhaps even weak. They had been humiliated in front of others, and that sting was hard to swallow. One of them suggested confronting the cowboy again to show that they were not afraid, but another, the tallest and most level-headed, shook his head. "No," he said firmly. "We've already made fools of ourselves. We should let this go. There's no need to make it worse." Still, the tension lingered. It was not hatred exactly, but unease. A realization that not everyone could be pushed around, that courage could appear in unexpected forms, and that quiet strength could command respect without ever raising a hand. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, the young woman decided she needed to speak to the cowboy, if only to thank him properly. She followed his path through town, careful not to startle him, until she saw him near the stables at the edge of town. He was checking his horse, brushing the dust from its coat and adjusting the saddle with practiced movements. She hesitated for a moment, unsure how to begin. Finally, she called out softly, "Excuse me, sir?" The cowboy looked up, his eyes calm and steady. He nodded politely. "Yes, I just wanted to thank you," she said, her voice slightly trembling. "This morning, you helped me when I didn't know what to do. I'm very grateful." He tipped his hat slightly, a small gesture that carried a quiet humility. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "I saw you needed help. That was enough." She took a step closer, gathering courage. "I want to understand, why did you step in? You didn't know me and you didn't have to get involved." The cowboy paused, considering her words. "Sometimes people need someone to stand with them," he said slowly. It doesn't matter if I know them or not. If I can help, I do. That's all." His words were simple, but they carried weight. The young woman felt a sense of clarity, as if a light had been turned on in her mind. Courage wasn't always about grand gestures or public recognition. It could be quiet, steady, and unwavering. It could come from someone who didn't seek attention but acted because it was the right thing to do. They talked for a few more minutes, sharing small stories about life in the town and the importance of looking out for one another. The cowboy didn't reveal much about himself. He had a quiet life and he preferred it that way. But the young woman understood that his strength came from experience, observation, and a commitment to doing what was right. As they spoke, the young woman felt a shift within herself. She realized she didn't have to be afraid anymore, that she could carry confidence and stand tall even in the face of intimidation. She didn't need to rely solely on someone else's courage, though she would always be grateful for it. She could find strength within herself, inspired by the quiet bravery she had witnessed that morning. Meanwhile, the town continued its routine, but the story of the morning was already spreading. People spoke in hushed tones about the cowboy who had intervened, and while he didn't seek recognition, his actions left an impression. The young woman felt the ripple of his bravery in subtle ways, neighbors offering small gestures of kindness, children learning that standing up for others was important, and even the men who had harassed her feeling the weight of accountability in their own reflections. As evening approached, the young woman returned home with a sense of renewed hope. The experience had been frightening, yes, but it had also been empowering. She had witnessed true courage, and she had learned that sometimes the right action was not about force or anger, but about quiet presence and unwavering calm. That night, as she prepared for bed, she thought again about the cowboy. She didn't know when she would see him again or if she ever would, but she carried his example with her. Courage, she realized, could appear in the simplest acts. A steady voice, a firm stance, a willingness to intervene when it mattered most. And sometimes that was enough to change everything. Outside, the town grew still, the sky painted with shades of orange and purple as the sun set behind the hills. The quiet cowboy returned to his own life, unnoticed by most, but leaving a mark that could not be erased. The young woman felt the echo of that morning in her heart. A reminder that people who act with integrity and courage, even quietly, make the world a safer and better place. And though the men would remember their humiliation, and perhaps think twice before attempting such intimidation again, the young woman knew that true strength came not from fear, but from the quiet, steady bravery that had walked into her life when she needed it most. The next morning, the town awoke to the same quiet rhythm it had always known, but beneath the calm, there was an undercurrent of tension. The young woman walked to the market, still carrying the lessons from the previous day in her heart. She moved with a steadier step now, her head held high, but she remained alert. The memory of the men's sneers still lingered, reminding her that courage was not a single moment, it was something that had to be sustained. She noticed people whispering as she passed, some nodding politely, others casting curious glances. The story of the cowboy's intervention had already spread through the town, and while she hadn't shared the details herself, the news had traveled fast. She felt a mixture of pride and embarrassment, proud that someone had acted, but uneasy that the incident had become the talk of the streets. The men, too, had returned to their usual spots in town, but there was a difference in their demeanor. Their arrogance was tempered with caution. The tallest among them, who had first sneered at the young woman, had begun to reconsider their approach. "We can't just act like nothing happened," he said quietly to the others. "People are watching." "We can't scare anyone the way we used to," one of the younger men frowned. "But we need to show that we're still in charge. We can't let a stranger tell us what to do." "Not everyone is a stranger," the tallest replied. "And sometimes the strongest people are the ones who don't need to shout. We need to be careful." Despite their words, the energy between them was tense, a mix of pride and unease. They hadn't expected someone to stand up to them so calmly, and the memory of the cowboy's presence unsettled them more than they wanted to admit. Meanwhile, the young woman reached the market and began selecting fresh vegetables, her mind still occupied with thoughts about courage and integrity. She noticed a few of the men lingering nearby, their eyes following her as she moved through the aisles. Her heart skipped a beat, but she refused to let fear control her. She remembered the cowboy's calm authority from yesterday, and it reminded her that she could face discomfort without succumbing to it. As she gathered her groceries, a familiar voice spoke from behind. "You look like you could use some help." She turned to see the cowboy standing just inside the market doorway. His presence was quiet but commanding, as if the air around him carried a calm assurance. He nodded politely as though acknowledging her strength while offering support. I'm fine," she said, a little flustered though comforted by his presence. "But thank you for being here again." "You don't need to thank me," he said simply. "I just wanted to make sure you were safe." His words, plain and steady, reminded her of yesterday. Courage wasn't about seeking recognition or proving something to others. It was about standing up for what was right, even if no one else noticed. She felt a warmth of gratitude, but also a new sense of confidence growing within her. At that moment, the men from yesterday entered the market. Their expressions were unreadable, a mix of uncertainty and lingering arrogance. The tallest among them stepped forward, attempting to gauge the situation. "Good morning," he said, though his voice lacked the usual mockery. The young woman froze for a split second, but then she remembered the lessons of the morning before. She straightened her back, met their gaze calmly, and continued selecting her groceries. The cowboy moved subtly between her and the men, a quiet but unmistakable shield of presence. He didn't speak harshly, didn't confront aggressively. He simply stood there, calm and unwavering. The tension in the air was palpable. The men had expected fear, expected an apology or retreat. Instead, they found themselves facing quiet confidence and steady resolve. It was disarming, more powerful than any shout or argument. After a few moments of silence, the tallest man muttered something under his breath, and the group eventually turned and left the market without incident. The young woman exhaled slowly, relief washing over her. The cowboy gave her a small nod, a gesture that said without words that she had handled herself well, and that she had nothing to fear when someone capable was watching out for her. Later that afternoon, the young woman walked along the town's main street, reflecting on the events of the past 2 days. She had learned that courage could take many forms, and that quiet strength often commanded more respect than overt displays of power. Her mind wandered to the cowboy, wondering how someone could remain so calm and effective under pressure. She decided to visit the local library, a small brick building at the edge of town, to borrow some books. It was a place she often went to think and plan, and today she felt a desire to learn more about courage, leadership, and integrity. As she entered, she spotted the cowboy outside, tending to his horse. He looked up, nodded briefly, and returned to his task. She wondered if he had ever been in situations like this before, where people underestimated him or tried to intimidate others. Inside the library, she browsed the shelves and selected a few books about leadership and personal growth. Her fingers lingered on the titles, absorbing the lessons she hoped to apply in her own life. She thought about how courage wasn't just about standing up to bullies. It was about making choices every day that reflected integrity, kindness, and respect. Meanwhile, outside, the cowboy finished with his horse and walked toward the stables. He moved with purpose, checking each detail carefully, ensuring the animals were safe and comfortable. His attention to detail and calm demeanor made it clear that his strength was not just physical. It was rooted in patience, observation, and consistency. As the young woman left the library, she noticed the men from earlier loitering near the town square. Their expressions were tense, their previous confidence diminished. She felt a spark of fear, but then remembered the cowboy's presence and the calm power he projected. She knew she could walk past them without incident, and she did. Step by step, she moved confidently, her posture firm, her gaze steady. The men watched her pass but said nothing. Later in the day, the cowboy returned to the cafe where the harassment had occurred. He spoke quietly with the owner, checking in about safety and making sure the staff felt secure. The cafe had become a symbol of the previous morning's events, and the cowboy's intervention had restored a sense of order and respect. The owner expressed gratitude, but the cowboy simply nodded, emphasizing that it wasn't about recognition. It was about doing what was right. As evening approached, the young woman met the cowboy again near the stables. She wanted to ask more about him, about how he had learned to remain calm under pressure and how he decided to step in when others hesitated. "Do you ever get scared?" she asked softly. The cowboy paused, thinking carefully. "Of course," he said finally. "But courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting even when you're afraid. You don't need to fight, shout, or prove anything. You just need to do what's right." The young woman nodded slowly, absorbing the lesson. It was simple, yet profound. Courage could be quiet. It could be steady, and it could inspire others without a word of praise. They walked together through the quiet streets as the sun set, the sky painted with shades of orange and pink. The town seemed to slow down around them, the soft evening light casting long shadows that stretched across the dusty roads. For the young woman, this walk was more than a simple journey. It was a moment of reflection, growth, and understanding. The cowboy didn't speak much, but his presence was enough. He didn't need to boast about his deeds or explain his motivations. His calm strength and quiet confidence spoke louder than words ever could. The young woman realized that she could carry that lesson with her, that she could face challenges with dignity and courage, inspired by the example she had witnessed. As night fell, the town grew still. People closed their shops, lit their lamps, and retreated to their homes. But the events of the day left a lasting impression. The young woman felt more confident, more self-assured, and more aware of the power of quiet courage. The men, too, had learned a lesson, though grudgingly. They understood now that intimidation wasn't always effective, and that strength could come in unexpected forms. The cowboy returned to his own routine, checking on his animals, making sure everything was in order, and preparing for the days ahead. He didn't seek recognition or applause. His satisfaction came from knowing that he had made a difference, that someone had been safe, and that courage had been demonstrated in its purest form. For the young woman, the experience was transformative. She had witnessed bravery, integrity, and quiet power, and she carried those lessons forward. She felt a new sense of independence, a confidence in her own abilities, and an understanding that fear could be met with calm determination. The town itself seemed different in subtle ways. People were more aware of each other, more willing to intervene when they saw injustice, and more respectful of quiet strength. And though the cowboy remained in the background, his actions created ripples that influenced the community in ways no one could have predicted. As the young woman prepared for bed that night, she reflected on the events of the past 2 days. She had been scared, she had been unsure, but she had learned that courage could be simple, steady, and effective. And sometimes it came in the form of a quiet cowboy whose presence alone could turn fear into safety and doubt into confidence. She closed her eyes with a sense of peace, knowing that the lessons she had learned would stay with her forever. Courage wasn't loud or demanding. It was quiet, consistent, and unwavering, and it could change lives. The morning sun rose over the small town, casting warm light across the dusty streets and wooden buildings. The young woman walked with a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. The events of the past days had left their mark on her, changing the way she saw herself and the people around her. She no longer felt small or timid in the face of challenges. Courage, she realized, was not a single moment. It was a habit, a choice made again and again. As she walked toward the market, she noticed familiar faces nodding to her politely. Some whispered softly about the cowboy and his quiet intervention. She felt a sense of pride and responsibility. What had happened was no longer just a story about being rescued. It was now a story about learning, growth, and standing strong. She wanted to honor that lesson in the way she carried herself. The cowboy appeared at the edge of the street, tending to his horse as he had so many times before. His movements were calm, deliberate, and confident, and she felt a reassuring presence just by seeing him. She didn't need him to speak or intervene this time. She knew she could handle herself. But she appreciated knowing that he was nearby, watching quietly, ready to step in if needed. The men who had harassed her earlier lingered near the town square again. This time, however, there was a difference in their attitude. They were quieter, more cautious. The tallest among them, who had once sneered and mocked, now avoided eye contact with the young woman entirely. He muttered something to the others, and they dispersed slowly, the arrogance from before replaced with uncertainty. They had learned, though reluctantly, that intimidation did not always work, and that courage and calm could hold more power than threats or loud words. The young woman continued her walk, feeling a new sense of independence. She greeted people along the way with confidence and warmth, carrying herself with dignity. She noticed the subtle changes in the town, the way neighbors seemed more willing to support one another, the way children watched her and smiled, and the quiet acknowledgement of respect she received from people who had once been indifferent. Courage, she realized, inspired others as much as it protected oneself. Later that afternoon, she decided to visit the cafe where the incident had first occurred. The owner greeted her warmly, a little relieved to see her back. "It's good to see you," he said. "I was worried after yesterday." "I'm fine," she said with a small smile, "and thanks to someone I feel even stronger now." She glanced toward the cowboy who stood a short distance away outside the cafe. He nodded slightly, his calm expression reflecting quiet pride. Inside the cafe, she noticed other patrons whispering softly. The story of her encounter with the men and the cowboy had spread through the town, and people were talking about courage, kindness, and integrity. She realized that this story was no longer just about her. It was about the way people could stand up for one another, even quietly, and how one small act of bravery could ripple through a community. As she enjoyed a cup of tea, the cowboy approached and sat across from her at a small wooden table outside. They didn't speak immediately. The warmth of the sun and the gentle hum of the town around them created a quiet moment of reflection. She felt a mixture of gratitude and admiration, not just for his actions, but for the example he had set. "You've learned a lot in just a couple of days," he said softly. "I can see it in the way you carry yourself." She nodded. "I have. I realized that courage isn't just about acting when someone is threatening you. It's about standing tall every day, even when it's hard. It's about helping others and staying calm in difficult situations." The cowboy smiled faintly. "Exactly. And sometimes courage is contagious. One act can inspire many." They sat in silence for a few moments, watching as the town went about its business. People walked past, children played near the fountain, and a gentle breeze carried the sounds of life through the streets. The young woman felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that she had grown stronger and more aware. She understood that bravery and integrity were not temporary. They were part of the choices she made each day. Later that evening, the young woman returned home, reflecting on the lessons she had learned. She thought about the cowboy, about the calm authority he displayed, and about how he had taught her that strength could be quiet yet powerful. She realized that the fear she had felt earlier had been real, but so was the courage that had risen to meet it. And now, she felt capable of facing any challenge with dignity and self-respect. That night, the town grew quiet as people settled into their homes. The young woman lay in bed, thinking about the ripple effects of the past few days. She understood that courage was not only about standing up to intimidation. It was about inspiring others to do the same, about showing kindness when it was needed, and about maintaining calm when tension threatened to take over. The next morning, the young woman walked through the streets with a renewed sense of confidence. The town seemed brighter, not because the sun was stronger, but because she noticed small gestures of respect and care all around her. Neighbors helped each other carry groceries, children greeted adults politely, and even those who had once acted arrogantly were behaving more considerately. The influence of courage and calm strength was spreading quietly but steadily. The cowboy appeared again, watching from a distance. He didn't interfere, but he observed the young woman with quiet satisfaction. His intervention had not only protected her, but had inspired growth and reflection in both her and the community. His role was simple: to act when necessary and to let others find their own strength. He had taught her that courage did not always require action. It sometimes required presence, patience, and trust in others. As the day progressed, the young woman continued to help where she could. She assisted the elderly with carrying groceries, offered a smile to children who were learning about respect and kindness, and spoke with neighbors about the importance of looking out for one another. Each small act reinforced the lessons she had learned, and she realized that courage was not a single heroic moment. It was the accumulation of small, consistent actions that built character and strength. By evening, the town felt transformed in subtle but meaningful ways. People moved with awareness, showing kindness, patience, and respect. The young woman had become a symbol of courage and resilience, not because of the incident itself, but because of how she had responded and grown. The cowboy, quiet as ever, continued his work in the stables, satisfied that the town was safer, kinder, and more aware of the power of quiet bravery. The young woman walked home as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange, pink, and purple. She felt gratitude for the lessons she had learned and for the presence of someone who had intervened without seeking recognition. She knew she would carry these lessons with her for the rest of her life, using courage, calm, and integrity in everything she did. That night she reflected on the journey of the past days. She had faced fear, witnessed bravery, and discovered her own strength. She had learned that courage could appear quietly, in subtle gestures and steady presence, and that it could inspire change in others without a word. The cowboy's example had shown her that true strength was not measured by aggression or dominance, but by the ability to act with calmness, fairness, and integrity. The town continued to thrive quietly, shaped by the ripples of courage and kindness. The young woman walked confidently, knowing that she could face challenges, help others, and contribute to a community that valued respect and integrity. And somewhere not far away, the cowboy continued his quiet life, tending to his horses, watching over the town, and serving as a reminder that heroes often act without recognition, leaving lasting impressions in the hearts of those they protect. In the weeks that followed, the young woman shared her story with friends and neighbors, not to boast, but to inspire others to act with courage and integrity. She encouraged people to stand up when they saw injustice, to support one another in times of need, and to understand that strength often comes in quiet, steady ways. Her confidence grew, and she became a trusted figure in the town, admired not just for her bravery but for her wisdom and kindness. The cowboy remained a quiet presence, always observing but rarely speaking. He knew that the young woman had learned the most important lesson, that courage could be simple, calm, and effective. He didn't need to be acknowledged or thanked. The satisfaction of seeing others grow and act responsibly was enough. As the sun set over the town, casting long shadows and bathing the streets in golden light, the young woman and the cowboy went their separate ways, each carrying the lessons of the past days. The town, too, had changed subtly but meaningfully. People moved with awareness, acted with kindness, and understood the power of quiet strength. And in that small town, where the events of a few days had sparked reflection, growth, and courage, the story of the quiet cowboy and the young woman lived on, not as a tale of fear or conflict, but as a story of bravery, integrity, and the quiet, steady power that can change. Lives forever